Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Erik Goodwyn, who is going to be speaking about his chapter that he wrote for the book Psychoanalysis and the MindBody Problem, which is an organized seminar series on the book starting last year and then throughout this year. Professor Goodwyn is, if I might say, more than just a rising star in the Jungian world. He's already contributed significant amounts of novel theory to both Jungian and neo-Jungian studies, as well as his clinical work. He's excelled in the ranks as well quite rapidly in his own career as a psychiatrist and as a Jungian practitioner. He currently now, having moved back from Billings clinic in Montana, he is attending physician at the UK Eastern State Hospital. He's also clinical associate professor with the University of Washington at the Billings Clinic and Psychiatry Department, as well as a professor in the University of Kentucky and University of Louisville, excuse me, in the Department of Psychiatry. And he's also our co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Jungian Studies. His several books spanning at least a decade have been, and I'll just highlight a few of them: The Neurobiology of the Gods, a psychological reading of the poem Beowulf, and Healing Symbols in Psychotherapy, as well as Understanding Dreams and Other Spontaneous Images. He's also rather made an impressive splash in his work in the philosophy of mind, and that is why one reason why we had him contribute to this book. But also it led into a series of exchanges between Erik and myself that have led to our forthcoming publication, which is a co-authored book that's coming out in 2 months with Routledge, and it's called Archetypal Ontology: New Directions in Analytical Psychology. So at this point, I imagine he'll be talking a little bit about what's in that book as well, but I will turn this over to our guest of honor today. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about philosophy. I wanted to start off with a quote by Spinoza. He says, this is part of his scholium, a circle existing in nature and the idea of the existing circle, which is also in God, are one and the same thing. Therefore, whether we conceive nature under the attribute of extension or under the attribute of thought, we shall find one and the same order or one and the same connection of causes. So this is 17th century. Spinoza is one of the earliest philosophers to express a modern non-physicalist metaphysics. And I say modern because both physicalism, which we'll get into in a minute, and non-physicalism has been around since the ancients. As it applies to Jung, Jung famously tried to avoid metaphysics. Frequently, he would make claims that he was not making metaphysical claims, or he didn't like metaphysics and all that sort of thing. But for all that effort, it seems like he couldn't keep himself from it. And in the early part of his career, he didn't focus so much on this metaphysical stuff and tried to ground his theory in biology. And this is an example of one of his early kind of biological models. where he says, just as the body has an anatomical prehistory of millions of years, so does the psychic system. And just as the human body today represents in each of its parts the result of this evolution, and everywhere still shows traces of its earlier stages, so the same may be said of the psyche. The psyche of the child is therefore equipped with all specificity, all the specifically human instincts, as well as the a priori foundations of the higher functions. So in other words, he's saying that in his model of the collective unconscious, he's saying that this is a biological derivation. And frequently he would kind of refer back to that sometimes in his writings, but particularly after his interaction with Wolfgang Pauli, he began to drift more into metaphysics, almost despite himself, where you can hear him say things like the following quote: "Since psyche and matter are contained in one of the same world, and moreover are in continuous contact with one another, and ultimately rest on irrepresentable transcendental factors, it is not only possible, but fairly probable even, that psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing." Now, note the similarity between that quote and the Spinoza quote that I read earlier. And here's an example, another example in a letter to Pauli, where he says, "In reality, there is no dissected world. For a unified individual, there is one unus mundus," he said. "We must discriminate this one world in order to be capable of conceiving it. But he must not forget that what he discriminates is always the one world. The discrimination is a presupposition of consciousness." So what are we supposed to do with this? It's the big question. If he's basically setting up a relationship between mind and matter that states that there is a deep connection between the two. And we'll get into some of the details of this as we go. Now, when he makes statements like this, that has implications for Jungian theory, in my opinion, because if your metaphysics is a physicalist metaphysics, you really can't make much sense of this. And what do I mean by physicalism? So physicalism is a metaphysics or a mind-body relation that is very, very popular these days. And it essentially states that all psyche derives ultimately from matter. So we have tiny bits of elementary particles, and when they combine, they produce psyche. So psyche is not an independent entity, it's derivative of matter. That's the physicalist position ultimately. So when we're saying that there is no dissected world, that there is a unus mundus, physicalism cannot make sense of that. Now, Jung's theory, therefore, would impinge upon metaphysical positions in a non-trivial way that I think we can't ignore, because it impacts its plausibility, and because Jung seemed to think that analytical psychology had metaphysical implications. And he would sometimes make comments like that. Our discoveries are showing us that the metaphysics must be this way rather than that way. Now, as much as I admire Jung, I think he got that backwards, that we can't really justify metaphysics based on psychology. Metaphysics is its own discipline, and we have to defend and a particular metaphysical position on its own merits, one way or the other, using metaphysical argument. And because it is dealing with the very subject and the categories that psychology already is running with by the time we get to talking about psychological theory. Well, this is what the psyche does. Well, okay, what's psyche though? So that's the problem. And so part of my chapter here is addressing this issue and saying, what can we do with this? Can we situate analytical psychology into a metaphysical position that's conciliant with it without any sort of major issues? Now, if you take a largely reductive system, say like classic Freudian theory, you can argue that physicalism works just fine within that, because you have, Freud famously tried initially to say that everything would be derived from neurology. But of course, he found that got to be too complex and gave up on that project, but it was always there in the background. but that assumes a physicalist position. So, so let me get back to physicalism then and kind of get a fuller definition of it. It's a metaphysical position that says that psyche is entirely derivative from matter. It's fully reducible to matter with zero remainder. That's kind of a hard physicalist position. There are other ones that are less reductive than that, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds with that, but that's kind of the general view, that there's matter, there's psyche, and one derives from the other, and that's that. So I think that this model, this metaphysics, is not really compatible with analytical psychology as Jung imagined it in his later career, when he began to think that it wasn't just biological substrata that organized things like archetypes in the collective conscious, but it was more fundamental principles of the universe. And then of course that's when he started to get into things like synchronicity, and sometimes he would dip into parapsychology as well. Now the problem, of course, is within his own metaphysics that he didn't really clearly articulate. Those things aren't all that mysterious or impossible. But if you're coming at it from a purely physicalist paradigm, which people like myself who were educated in the biomedical system, we kind of assumed that going in, and I had to unlearn some of that as I was reading Jung as a resident physician and later. And I just sort of felt my way into it and understood what he was getting at, and didn't realize we were dealing with a philosophical issue. So now, you might say, well, what's the big deal about this? Well, physicalism is very popular, and it might be okay with the early biological form of analytical psychology that just says it's instincts and that's it. There's no deeper principles at work, in which case we'd have to give up on the idea of synchronicity making a whole lot of sense. And we couldn't make sense of the unus mundus or some of the mysticism that Jung works with and develops and talks about. We would still have to discard those things as not possible within this metaphysical paradigm. Now, the problem, of course, with doing that is, if we're going to bet on physicalism because of its popularity, we might be running into problems, because there is a growing body of literature that is challenging physicalism. And I should say, too, that historically speaking, the physicalist paradigm or metaphysics, has been around since the ancients, but it wasn't really all that popular until around the late 19th and early 20th century, where it just roared to the forefront of philosophical discussion. And only in the last few decades are we seeing some serious challenges to it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the biggest ones. And I think it's one of the biggest ones because many of the other ones kind of roll into it. And the biggest objection to physicalism is the explanatory gap problem. So the explanatory gap problem is basically like this. I have a bunch of isolated molecules, or even just cells, none of which seem to have subjective consciousness or awareness of any kind, not in the way we understand it anyway. And yet, if I take those same cells and organize them just so, the combination of them will have conscious awareness. And we know this because every person here has a working brain and body, and they are presumably conscious if they haven't fallen asleep by this point in my lecture. And so how does that work? How does that work? The phenomenal qualities and properties that we talk about, that John, for example, talks a lot about in his work, where does this stuff come from? The color, various colors, the taste of beer, the sound of a guitar chord. It's funny, all my examples could be found in a pub. Never mind. So how those things appear very different from matter, and yet physicalism claims that they must derive somehow from matter. So this is the explanatory gap problem. It's saying we have no way of explaining how that works at all. And there's a couple of different counter answers to this that we'll get into, but just to be clear, let me rephrase this problem again, just so you really understand what's going on here. Aggregates of isolated bits of matter individually don't seem to be conscious. When they arrange just so, however, consciousness appears. And the explanatory gap problem is essentially saying we don't have any idea how that works. Do these properties just appear out of nowhere, ex nihilo? Or what about neuroscience, right? This is something David Chalmers calls promissory materialism or promissory physicalism. And it goes something like, well, neuroscience is teaching us so much about the mind and the brain and how it works that someday we'll figure it out. Just because we can't explain it now doesn't mean we won't be able to later. So if you want to bank on that, though, you have to reconcile the fact that in all of our knowledge, and we've gained huge amounts of information, and we'll talk about some of this a little bit later, about how neuroscience impacts consciousness, how it correlates with it. Well, that's the issue, is we've learned that it correlates, and that's it, right? And the more we learn about neuroscience, the more we learn what exactly particular states correlate with consciousness, but we're still lacking the explanation. Now, this is only a problem if you're a physicalist, though, because the physicalist insists that psyche must somehow come from matter. So if I'm making that claim, I have to back it up with an explanation of some kind. I can't just say it must, and that's that, although I have read papers like that. They're not very convincing. There are other alternatives, of course. One is idealism, which states that it's like physicalism, but the other way around. It says matter is the thing that's less real than psyche. Psyche is first, matter is derivative of psyche. And usually in those types of frameworks, you come upon something like a God type figure, universal consciousness sort of thing. There's also some other types of relations too between mind and matter that, for example, Spinoza, which we started with, advocated for something called neutral monism, which says that psyche and matter, they don't derive from each other, but both of them derive from a neutral substance, which is itself neither mind nor matter, but is somehow both. And if you want to learn more about that, I would strongly recommend Harold Atmanspacher's work on this subject. And he's really developed that way of integrating metaphysics with analytical psychology. My view is a little bit different, and I don't think it's actually mutually exclusive from his, but it might be a little easier to understand. But then there's one other one. There's one other alternative to physicalism. And remember, the only reason we're trying to figure out if there's any alternatives is because we want to see if any of Jung's concepts are compatible with one of these. And because physicalism is not very compatible with some of the late analytical psychology concepts. If psyche is entirely derived from matter alone, only, and has no independent sort of being, then it's very difficult to make sense of the unus mundus and synchronicity and some of the other things he talks about, mystical union and all that, except as a metaphor. And you can always argue that. Anyway, so in the 90s, David Chalmers wrote a book called The Conscious Mind, where he goes through all this stuff in very clear detail and sets out his own solution to the explanatory gap problem, which he calls PanPsychism. Well, he doesn't call it that. He avails himself of that. It's an old view, which simply says that all the matter in the universe has psyche associated with it, and that psyche is a fundamental principle or property of the universe. Just like mass or charge, everything has psyche. And there's two different kinds here. There's micropsychism and there's cosmopsychism. Okay, and the difference is micropsychism argues that every individual particle has some kind of little bit of psyche associated with it. So even electrons have their little tiny electron psyches, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but I mean, unless you're going to be a physicalist, you have to assume that some of these issues some of this might be true. And then cosmopsychism says the entire universe is the source of consciousness, which we'll get to more of that later, because that's the solution I wound up with as I work through this stuff. So before I dive too much into that, though, I did want to give a little shout out for some of the attempts to get around the explanatory gap that physicalists have offered up. One of them is eliminativism. And this would be like the position of Daniel Dennett or Susan Blackmore, both with a strong neuroscience background, or in the case of Dennett, he acquired a strong neuroscience background. And anyway, this says, well, psyche and matter, we don't have to worry about the explanatory gap because psyche is an illusion. Which most of the time when I say that to Jungians, they snicker and chuckle because that really doesn't make much sense. But let's just go with it for a minute. The idea is that since the brain and the mind is designed to create representations of the world, I don't agree with that, but never mind. It will create this a working model that has unity and coherence and subjectivity and so forth and so on, but it's just there to help us to function and survive. It doesn't represent anything real. So in other words, they've kind of argued themselves out of existence with this workaround. So to me, it doesn't seem like much of a good workaround. And the main problem with it is I don't really care if it represents anything in particular. It still needs to be explained in and of itself. So if the brain creates this model to represent the universe, how does it do that? All right, so the eliminativist counter argument seems to run into its own problems here, and that it doesn't really explain the explanatory gap. It sidesteps it. The other one is similar. It's called identity theory, which says that the brain state is exactly equivalent to the mind state in a purely semantic way, that there's really nothing to explain, and neither is derivative necessarily. It's just an alternative form of description. And long story short, without getting into the weeds with this one, it winds up with the same problem that limitativism does, which is that it's just sidesteps the issue with some semantics, in my opinion. And if anybody's interested, they can read the fuller explanation of this. But so then, what I noticed about this when I was studying and trying to get my head around this mind-body problem, because I noticed that it seemed like everything seemed to run right into this ultimately. We were trying to explain really at the fundamental level what's going on. In my world, we talk a lot about how the brain is operating, and I prescribe medications that alter brain function and all this. But how does that change the experience, the phenomenal experience? Well, that's the mind-body problem, and most of the time we just sort of shrug and carry on and prescribe our medicines and go about our day. But I can't do that. I have to cogitate on the problem. So what I noticed is that even if you develop a panpsychist solution, right? So you say that all of the parts, little particles in the universe, have their own little tiny psyche, you still run into an explanatory gap problem. And I'm not the first person to notice this, actually. This goes back as far as Descartes and elaborated on by William James. James called it the combination problem, which is if I have a ton of little tiny micropsyches, and yet somehow jamming them together creates a macropsyche. Why? So he called that the combination problem. And then even in neuroscience, there's a thing called the binding problem, which is trying to figure out how the brain takes different sensory impressions and binds them together into a single coherent image. We don't know how the brain does that. And in fact, I think it's a philosophical issue. And many philosophers agree with that too. So we've got all three of these different problems that all seem to be stemming from Mirology. And that was, I think, the insight that helped me flesh out the rest of the answer to this, in my opinion. So what is Mirology? Mirology is the study of parts and wholes. Very simple. And the fundamental question of Mirology is what is prior, ontological, the part or the whole? How do they relate to each other? And again, this is another rabbit hole we could go down, but I'll summarize. You've got two essential points of view on this. The pluralist point of view says that the properties of wholes derive from properties of parts in isolation. The holist says, no, that doesn't work. You can't derive all the properties of the whole from just the properties of the parts. There's something the whole has that's greater than the sum of the parts. All right, so nothing really new here. I imagine that Jung would go along with the latter position, given that previous quote on the Unus Mundus, especially. But what I thought of when I read about this is that this is the same issue that we're dealing with the explanatory gap problems and the combination problem. We're saying, how does psyche emerge from the combination of neural activities? Well, that's the same thing as saying, where do the properties of the whole come from? And if I'm a pluralist and I say the parts of the whole derive from the parts, or the properties of the whole derive from the properties of the parts, then I have an explanatory gap problem within that system. Same thing for the combination problem. I'm still asking the same thing. I'm saying, how do little micropsyches jam it together and create a macropsyche? So there was a very influential paper by a guy named Jonathan Schaeffer, who actually helped me work on my philosophy paper. It was written in 2010. It's called Monism, the Priority of the Whole. And he dives deep into this issue of wholes and parts. And when I read that, I realized, along with some reading on, from Ficino, actually, of all places, these two, it's kind of inspired me to look at the mind-body problem in a different way and say that this is a mirological issue here, that what we're demanding neurons and molecules to conjure up the properties of the whole, and they're not equipped to do that, and that's why we have an explanatory gap problem. And all these efforts to get around it are never going to succeed because of this. It's a conceptual issue. So an important piece to this, though, so let's kind of bring it down out of the abstract for a second. The priority of this type of holism is not chronological, it's ontological. Okay, what does that mean? That means that holistic properties emerge because an aggregate is coming together into a more fundamental state, not a less fundamental state. And when I first started going through this with John, especially, he said, that seems like it's backwards. And from the standard way of looking at things, which is a very physicalist, very pluralist paradigm, which has been very popular for the last 150 years or so, it is backwards. It is backwards. But it's not new. It's not new. The holistic position, actually, and Schaeffer goes into this, was the dominant paradigm for the longest time, that the properties of parts derived from the wholes, they were separated from, interestingly enough. Okay, so what does this do? If we look at the psyche and the mind-body problem this way, then we're going to say the psyche is a holistic property of a particular type of system, a physical system. And that property does not derive from those pieces, those physical pieces, because it's a holistic property, and it doesn't work that way because we're holists. Okay, so this is why I made the distinction in PanPsychism between micro and cosmic. Micropsychism is still a pluralistic point of view from the mirological point of view. And I thought that's just going to run into the explanatory gap problem, which they call the combination problem in that context. But what if we take it from the other point of view and say the whole is prior to the parts, and the most fundamental object in the universe is the entire universe, and everything else derives from it, in the way that we're used to thinking the other way around, which is physicists have identified these various fundamental particles and everything derives from them. Well, the holist looks at that and says, that's backwards, right? As Plotinus might put it, matter is the least fundamental thing in the universe, not the most. The most fundamental thing in the universe is, in his paradigm, the one. So this, looking at the mind-body problem from this point of view leads you, as you can imagine, quite quickly to a cosmopsychist point of view, which is that psyche and matter are one, and the most fundamental object in the universe would be the universe itself. And it must therefore have the property of psyche, and all of us have it because we're tiny bits of it, and we derive those properties from the cosmos. So that's the part of this system that would be called a brute fact. And all the metaphysical systems have brute facts. In physicalism, the brute fact is saying that when matter organizes together, these emergent properties come out of nowhere. And well, that's just brute emergence. Okay. So without getting too much in the weeds of that, though, we'll just go kind of directly to the cosmos aspect of this and how it plays into analytical psychology. So now, before I get into the cosmopsychism, I would like to say that this is not an idea of mine. This has been around for a while, and even in modern sources. So the physicist and mathematician Bernard Espinat, for example, philosopher Philip Goff, Ite Shani, Avaza, a couple of different, as well as new and ancient philosophers have ascribed to a position like this, which says that the fundamental whole is ontologically the most prior. So then how does this work on a day-to-day level? Like, how is this, we're getting way up in the clouds here. How does this work on the day-to-day level? So let's observe that we'll kind of mentally go through some systems to show what I mean by this. Let's follow the observation, for example, from neuroscience that some systems have consciousness and some don't seem to have much, if any. So a pile of sand, for example, doesn't seem to have a lot in the way of consciousness. Maybe it does, I don't know, but it's probably not anything like what we have. So what's the difference, though, really? Well, the difference is integratedness. We observe this in neuroscience over and over and over again. And I think the best example of this would be within the brain itself. If you look at the frontal lobe compared to, say, the cerebellum, right? So real briefly, the frontal lobe is going to be up in the front of the brain, in the cortex, and these areas are associated with conscious awareness. And if they get damaged or down-modulated, or you go to sleep, say, these are less active, and so the consciousness dims along with it. Now, the cerebellum, which has way more neurons than the frontal cortex does, in fact, half of the neurons in your entire central nervous system are cerebellum neurons, funny enough. If you can remove that, though, and your consciousness won't disappear. It'll be greatly altered, of course, because you lose a lot of coordination. That's what the cerebellum is supposed to be doing. So what's the difference between those two? Well, the difference is their integratedness is different. The frontal lobe, each neuron is sensitive to the activities of almost all the other neurons in the frontal cortex. So there's this dense interactivity going on in there. The cerebellum, though, is a feed-forward system. You put input in, it processes it, and you get an output that's usually more coordinated. That's the whole point of the cerebellum. So it seems to be that integratedness is the thing that is needed in order to get consciousness. So then, what are we really saying then? It's not the neurons, it's the form of the neurons. And that's a pretty important distinction, I think. Because the isolated neuron, if you take them all out and put them in little petri dishes, you won't get consciousness out of that. Unless you're looking at maybe the individual consciousness of a neuron, right? I don't know how you do that, but you could argue that it might exist. But the point is that you put them all together, you get a regular, everyday, garden variety human consciousness from that, which we know exists more than we know anything else, except for the eliminativists, right? They've argued themselves out of existence, so we don't have to worry about them. So it's the arrangement and their integratedness that correlates with consciousness. But I have to be careful here. It would be easy to say, oh, well, integratedness creates consciousness. But if I did that, I would be pluralist. I would have an explanatory gap problem. Because again, I don't know what it is about integratedness that would magically conjure up consciousness out of it. It just seems to do that. So I'm not going to go that way. I'm going to say the reason that you have consciousness is because an integrated system is more closely related to the consciousness that is the most fundamental, i.e. the cosmic consciousness. It's the most integrated, largest and most integrated system in the universe. It's the universe itself. And you can defend that position from the monist position that Schaeffer talks about in his paper. You can use quantum mechanics. There's a bunch of different arguments for this. But again, I don't want to bog down this too much with all that. But just the point being that if integratedness is the key ingredient here, then there's really nothing all that special about the brain other than it has a spectacularly high level of integratedness. But what about systems of humans' brains? What about ecosystems or planets or even stars? I remember reading this one paper by Sir Roger Penrose, famous mathematician, who made a similar argument that I'm making, that stars might be conscious because of the way the waves operate on the surface of the stars is very similar to theta waves in the brain. That blew my mind. And maybe sounds kind of wild, but then if you look at ancient cultures that worship the sun, maybe they were onto something, right? Maybe they could feel that, I don't know. But the point I want to make, though, is that I'm not saying that the integratedness conjures up consciousness out of midair, because that would be a pluralist point of view, and I'd have an explanatory gap problem. Rather, I'm saying that it's because it gets closer to the proper form needed to get to be associated with it, and that's where it comes from. So the closer we get to the one or the whole, the unus mundus, the more consciousness we get, and the more integratedness is associated with that. So in a nutshell, right, brains clearly possess the quality of consciousness, and they're a highly integrated system. Human beings are a very highly integrated system. We know when they're disassembled, consciousness disappears. In other words, if you kill somebody. But we know the opposite too. We watch as children develop from single cells, that consciousness appears during the assembly process. So from the holistic point of view, we have to argue that biology doesn't create consciousness. It discovers it. It finds the correct form required to obtain consciousness, and that consciousness itself doesn't come from below in the isolated pieces, but from the larger, more integrated system. So now let me wrap up with how does all this relate to analytical psychology? It's that since each consciousness, though distinct, is still but one piece of a much larger whole, we can look at the archetypes in the way that Jung did, and it is fully integrated with this metaphysics. It has no problems with it. You could say that the archetypes are principles of progressively greater and more whole psychic integration. They are, as John points out in his work, fundamental principles that that must exist, really, unless you are going to give up on the principle of sufficient reason, right? Which I'm not ready to do that. An analogy to this would be islands on an ocean, right? So above the water, the islands all look separate, but under the water, they're all connected and they're all one. Similar kind of mental picture. What are the advantages of this? Right, so philosophically, the advantage of this metaphysics, aside from the fact that it is easier to integrate some of Jung's more mystical ideas with it, is that there's no explanatory gap problem. I don't have to explain where consciousness comes from. It's more fundamental. I don't have a explosion of brute facts. I don't have to try to explain how all these individual phenomenal experiences magically emerge from various neural states. It's easy for me to understand how synchronicity and psi and near-death experiences and mystical oneness and even entheogens and brief glimpses into the cosmic consciousness and all that stuff, that's all explainable and understandable within this framework without having to just poo-poo it out of hand and say, well, it's just impossible, which is what a lot of folks do, unfortunately. But it's because of this underlying assumption of physicalism that they're doing that. And apparently not aware of the objections to physicalism, such as the explanatory gap problem. Then the final advantage is that you can look at these things in more detail, since we've got a framework to make sense of it all in a more organic way. The unus mundus, for example, would just simply be the cosmic consciousness, all matter and all psyche existing at the most fundamental whole level. And that when Jung is perceiving this or hypothesizing it, then that's what it is within that metaphysics. It's not just a pure conjuration of his theorizing. It's something which must exist within this metaphysical framework. So, questions, comments? Mental overload. I covered a lot.
Well, I found your paper really exciting to read. And I was most excited when you got to the Neoplatonists, because that's what particularly interests me. And but I was thinking about that your paper is very focused on the what you call the late AP, right?
Yes.
But I suppose, and trying to find, in a way, one answer. I suppose my interest is more what I would call sort of actually existing analytical psychology. And I think, I mean, for me, the variety of views in Neoplatonism, because there are so many different views of emanation and return.
Yes.
I think you can find all of those reflected in analytical psychology.
Oh, I totally agree.
Like Fordham, Giegerich, Hillman, they all have some version of a Neoplatonist structure. So
I can see that.
yeah, so that, I suppose, I don't know, that maybe is not a philosophical question, more a history of ideas question, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I agree. The Neoplatonists, I just for funsies, I read the Aeneids, and I was blown away by that, and that kind of really set the stage for, as I was learning later about neuroscience and analytical psychology, I'm like, this ties into this ancient way of thinking so tightly. And I know that Jung mentions a few of the Neoplatonists, maybe Iamblichus or Proclus, but not much. But he seems to me to owe a pretty great debt to a lot of the work that they did, particularly Plotinus. But especially when I started getting to this holism versus pluralism stuff, I realized that not only is Plotinus arguing that matter is the least fundamental piece of the universe, which is what we're talking about, but he gets into the whole idea of unity within multiplicity and how that works. And the language that they use is, I think, sometimes a barrier for modern readers. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, the concepts that he uses and the emanations, a modern reader might look at that and say, well, and what's emanating from what, right? They'll take it literally and say, where's this beam coming from and all that sort of thing. But these were metaphors, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I find that the whole emanation and return very exciting. But I mean, I think one thing that modern people also have a problem with is the coincidence of opposites. That,
the unity of multiplicity there.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Anyway, I really enjoyed the paper and your talk. Faith, I think you've got your hand up there. You're on mute, Faith.
Still can't hear you.
Can't hear you. Are you unmuted?
Okay, let's see if does that help at all?
That's better.
Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So my question was a bit like yours, David, that I was interested in the Neoplatonist stuff. I really, really liked your paper, Eric, so thank you so much. But you did mention Ficino, and I'm sort of interested how he dovetailed with your research. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. So I was, again, as I was following along in the scholastics and the Neoplatonists, again, just kind of for fun, for my own interest, bumped into Platonic theology. And as if you're a fan of Ficino, you know what that is, and you know that book. And he talks about how does he phrase it? Essentially, that what is the source of the unity of being? And it's very abstract terms, but he makes very good logical points. Like, how can unity derive from multiplicity? That doesn't make any sense. And when I read that, I was just absolutely blown away. I said, this guy solved the mind-body problem 500 years ago, and nobody noticed. I was just absolutely gobsmacked by that. But it must have been just something I happened to see when I read it, and many others probably read it and didn't think of much of it. But I realized, because in my head, I'm reading this and I'm like, wholes and parts. I had neurons and psyche. Right? That's the equation that I've been using. And when you do that, it jumps right out at you that he basically eliminates the explanatory gap problem through this logical argument. It takes like 4 pages. It's wild. It's wild. So that's where I came across Ficino, and it took me probably 6, 7 years to formulate that into a paper that I could publish in Synthes, which came out last year. So no, actually 2 years ago now. I forgot, it's 2023. And that one's called Heaps and Syllables, Minds and Bodies, Heaps and Syllables.
I liked that too. I thought that was a really neat image, and I hadn't heard that before. So
well, it's from Aristotle.
right.
Yeah, so Aristotle talks about the difference between a heap and a syllable, and that's exactly what I'm getting at. So, and of course, anybody who's interested in that paper, just let me know, email me or whatever, and I'll send you a copy of Heaps and Syllables. It's got all the full, heavy jargon philosophical argument in it, for your further enjoyment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Roderick?
Thanks very much, Eric. I really enjoyed your paper, and particularly the sections on Mirology, which I haven't thought through very much myself, and I found those very illuminating, actually. And but I'd like to ask a question first, really, about the relationship of the sort of model that you presented, this sort of cosmopsychist model, to the dual aspect Monus model that Harold Atmansbacher and people have developed. Because there's, particularly in his latest book, which I'm sure you're aware of, the one he wrote with Dean Rickles, he's very explicit in distinguishing his dual aspect Monus approach from a cosmopsychist one, partly on the grounds that he thinks the cosmopsychist approach is still a sort of what he calls a two-place solution to the mind-body problem, in the sense that it's still operating with, psyche and matter are both there always, all the way up and all the way down, as it were. Whereas in the model that he's presenting, you've got psyche and matter as two sorts of domains that decompose from something else, which is psychophysically neutral, not a bothness, but a neitherness, if you like. Yes. So, and that's that the way in which he sees that as a third term, he seems to think is very important for what he and Dean Rickles do in relation to their understanding of meaning. And how meaning sort of instantiates itself and expresses itself. The difference between the meaning of the sort of surface structure of meaning, of the referential meaning between psyche and matter, observer and observed, and so on, and the sort of what they call the deep structure of meaning, which underlies that, and which they locate in this third domain of the psychophysically neutral. So how is that consistent with, or compatible with, or different from the model that you've presented?
Amazingly excellent question. In fact, Harold and I have had quite a few exchanges over this very question, because he sent me a copy of that book, and I sent a review of it to Synthes. I haven't heard back from him. It's a phenomenal, amazing book. Very heavy on the math, right? So just make sure you bring your fighting trousers for that. But I think that his critique of the cosmopsychism does make sense to me, like saying that it's all the way down. It's not exactly what I'm proposing. I'm not saying that there needs to necessarily be any sort of psyche involved in the smallest and most isolated bits. And there's also a little bit of wiggle room there, in the sense that what is a system can be defined many different ways. And for example, the human body. I like to use the example of the human body because everybody's familiar with it. And one part of this system is a lot more associated with consciousness than, say, the femur, right? So it's not that they contribute necessarily equally. It's the whole integratedness question. And so this is where I think I do believe there's a great deal of compatibility between our systems, especially if you say, okay, if the most fundamental consciousness is that of the universe, and there's also a physical universe as well, well, then the next step would be to logically go that the neutral substance is also a singular substance, right? Mm-hmm. Weaving in the Mirology into it the way I've done with PanPsychism and the other cosmopsychists. So I think that's the connection. And then my own kind of questions for him, if you were reading the book, you might have recognized the question of, well, what causes the split that he talks about so frequently, right? And I asked him that directly, and he said, well, we're still working on that. And I'm like, oh, that's fair enough. It's not an easy question. And, you know, with my way of looking at it, in a sense, he's dealing with what's called a decomposition problem. I didn't want to dive into that too much, but anyway, so I think there's a lot more work to be done, and I will hopefully get to talk to him this year in Switzerland, since I think we'll both be there for the conference.
Okay.
Yeah, for the big conference.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Steve?
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Really interesting talk. I think my question you may have covered, although I missed it because there's a lot of information in there that I was trying to assimilate, and it was that there's I was looking at another explanatory gap that was forming in my mind as you were talking about your model, and I think you may have touched on it, but I didn't spot the answer to this question at the time. Why does a biological integrated system make a connection with this cosmic consciousness, whereas a much more highly integrated computer system does not? What's the difference between the two?
Great question. So it hinges on the question of integratedness and like what is the full definition of that. And this, I didn't mention this, but this is coming from the work of Giulio Tononi and his integrated systems theory of consciousness, T-O-N-O-N-I. Now, Tononi and I don't see exactly eye to eye on on everything, but I think he's really onto something with this integrated information theory. So he actually answers that very question in his papers, and the long story short of it is, it depends on what kind of program you have, and it's very analogous to the cerebellum versus the frontal lobe, and it's the systems where each individual part are tightly and delicately interconnected with every other part are the ones that seem to correlate with consciousness. Other systems that are perhaps quite complex and have very complicated decision trees to them, and maybe even an orders of magnitude more items within them, but are not connected in that way, will not correlate with consciousness. There needs to be feedback at almost every level before you see that, for whatever reason. So the sophisticated computer programs that you're talking about, most of them are more feed-forward systems. They're algorithmic. They're derived from an engineer who says, I need to solve this problem. Now, some of these ones that are like self-learning and all that, that starts to get into the question of, oh, okay, maybe they will be conscious. And I'm sure we'll find out eventually, because AI is just, you know, barreling forward full steam ahead, and damn the torpedoes. And hopefully we won't end up with Skynet, but, you know, here we are. So hopefully it answers the question. It's the arrangement.
I'm not sure if it does or not, because it was the sort of neural network type of computer that I was thinking of, because that does, you know, I mean, that is modeled on the way that the human brain has this high degree of interconnectedness. In that case,
it very well could be associated with consciousness. I can't think of a reason why it wouldn't be, outside of maybe some kind of vitalism, right? Which nobody really takes that seriously anymore. That there's something special about biological systems that only they can have consciousness. It's a very sneaky idea, but I don't see how it holds. You know, and so in that case, it's a argument for strong AI. Just integrated systems theory. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Scary, maybe.
Debbie?
Hi there. Thank you, Eric. I really enjoyed that. My question actually sort of comes off of Steve's. Well, it doesn't come off of Steve's. I was thinking about it. The thing about the thing about the difference. Hang on a second. I've just written a note about what I wanted to say. Yeah, this thing about the cerebellum and the frontal lobe that you were talking about, and then the idea of the consciousness, the greater consciousness being related to the closeness to the whole. I was just thinking about the difference between my consciousness and the birds outside my window, because I've just moved house to have a garden, and I'm absolutely fascinated by what the birds are doing, and the birds seem to be really fascinated by me, and they keep coming to the window and looking at what I'm doing. And then there's this robin that keeps speaking to me, and it keeps like doing this thing and looking at me and then speaking, like really like shouting. And I'm thinking, what is it thinking about? And what's the difference between my consciousness? And because obviously it's saying something to me, I don't know what, or it's trying to communicate with me. And I was just thinking, I'm wondering if you had a thought on that, really.
Well, I mean, this whole system basically says that the closer you are to the most integrated system in the universe, whatever that is, whether it's the universe or not, is not necessarily required for this theory, but there needs to be at least one in the abstract. So the closer you are to that, the more comprehensive and fine-grained and aware the consciousness will be. So it all kind of boils down to how tightly integrated is the bird system, right? And it's not just the brain, right? It's the brain and the body, right? That's essential. So, of course, if you look at corvids in particular, their ability to learn is phenomenal, and they have language and they have very sophisticated thought processes. So I guess I don't know if I'm answering a question so much as just sort of saying this to me seems that they have a consciousness of some kind, what its likeness, certainly. That seems self-evident to me. It would have to be. Otherwise, how do I explain my own consciousness? What's so special about humans? In the grand scheme of things, really nothing compared to other animals. And it's not that we aren't amazing, it's that everything is amazing. That's just my way of looking at it. Somebody mentioned, I don't know if I see that. Yes, the concept of Brahman and holism. Like I said, I've seen inklings of this in like Taoism and Brahman. I'm not an expert on those systems, but it seems to me that they are also very holistic in the same kind of sense that I'm describing, that the cosmic consciousness would be something equivalent to what is spoken of when we say God or Brahman or Tao and that kind of stuff. But I'm sure somebody out there knows more than this could dive further into it.
Roderick?
Just on that, one of Harold Plattenbacker's papers, I think it's called something about dual aspect monism and its relatives or something. He does talk about the Hindu models and in relation to it, as well as David Bohm and some other approaches. I had another question, which is in relation to your Mirology. You sort of relate or associate the whole with the mind and the part with the body when you're sort of setting this up, if you've make those sort of associations and then are arguing that the whole is prior to the parts.
Yes.
So implying that mind is prior to the body, and that the body in some ways derives from the mind. In what way are you avoiding a sort of? How is this not idealism?
Well, there's it does impinge upon the idea of idealism, certainly, and in a sense, I'm also arguing for formal causation too, because the mind is formally caused, in this system. But idealism is to say that matter is derivative from mind, whereas what I'm saying is that mind is a property of physical systems. So whereas mind can exist in the larger context, right? And maybe individual minds might come and go, but the conscious cosmic mind does not go anywhere because it's the entire universe, it's the whole system. So that's one difference. And another difference is that idealism, I didn't get into this, but idealism has its own problem, which is the regularity problem, which is Chalmers talks about this in his work of why is it that matter behaves in these consistent, regular ways if it's really just derivative from mind? And this is really not an easy way to answer that question, as far as I'm aware. There might be, but you know, you could still make the argument that you could work your way into it from a certain angle, I think, into idealism this way. Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that in the model that you're presenting, there's a sort of whilst the mental and the physical are sort of two aspects, as it were, that there's a sort of an asymmetry towards the mental, in the sense of the side of the mental. There's not a total parity between them in some way.
Well, yeah, because part of the issue is that matter, at least as we conceptualize matter, is distinct and full of plurality. And so by definition, then you're looking at parts, which can't be as prior as the one. Now, Schaeffer gets into some of this, the ideas of the universe being gunky and full of gunk instead of junk. You may be familiar with that. And in which case, that distinctiveness is actually an illusion. And so when you get to that, maybe not so asymmetrical. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's a great question. It's not one I really dove into, but it's worth thinking about, certainly.
Raymond?
Hi. Yeah, Eric, I just want to, actually what you said tonight actually makes me think actually is, I'll talk about a bad experience I had maybe just about a month ago, like very recently. Yeah. So so actually, it's quite strange. Yeah. So I went. Okay. So basically, what happened to me was I went to the gym, and while I was there, I was conscious of things. Well, I don't know. I think that conscious. For a time, yeah, I was conscious of what was happening actually in the gym. Yeah, so I was conscious of people being there. I remember very clearly, yeah, everything, yeah. But I forgot, that I had a life outside the gym. Yeah, so it took me actually some time. I stayed in the gym from maybe 6 o'clock. I don't know what time I arrived until maybe 12 o'clock in the evening. Yeah, which I don't normally do. Yeah, but I was conscious of being in the gym, but I forgot I had a life outside the gym. Yeah, and it actually took some time really for that to come back. Yeah, so I was quite worried about it. Yeah, so and then I went for like tests, and I got a diagnosis of was a global temporary amnesia. Yeah. So yeah. I suppose kind of made me think because it says I get consciousness, but I was thinking I didn't really have a kind of a very integrated consciousness. I forgot really about my life outside the gym.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were aware of things outside of what your conventional consciousness, right?
Yeah. Well, just I was aware of the immediate situation. Yeah. But I lost awareness. I lost awareness of having a life, outside
of your own individual
for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and transient global amnesia is very mysterious.
Yeah.
But we don't really know what causes it, and it just sort of seems to get better on its own, and we just sort of shrug our shoulders at it. But from a metaphysical point of view, from what we're talking about, you could make hypotheses at least and say, ask, is this a temporary kind of lapse of the individual conscious awareness that goes along with, because see, within this system, you have systems within systems within systems of consciousness, right? We are a consciousness within a cosmic, but there's probably multiple layers of systems between that, because, you know, we also have the Earth and the solar system and all that kind of thing. And if they're integrated enough, then why not? You know, they could as well, just because we are. It's at least consistent with that. So getting back to your experience, that along with other things like near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences and all kinds of stuff like that, in a physicalist system, you have to come up with some reason why your brain was malfunctioning. And then that explains everything, apparently, from that point of view, rather than it could be something else. Could be something else. And I think that since I'm arguing that biology discovers consciousness through its forms, through its slow evolution of neural networks and so forth, and it doesn't necessarily have to be neurons either. I think they've been looking at plants as well now. That's another conversation, but it means that if this is how it works, then sometimes biology can cue into higher levels of consciousness accidentally. And I say accidentally because being conscious of the conscious, you know, like having an awareness of the cosmic consciousness would not necessarily be conducive to survival, right? Because I would just be at one with everything and I wouldn't necessarily worry about my own body survival. So I believe then that the brain probably has normative systems in place to keep that in check. And only in altered states or under the existence of drugs or, you know, random blips, because biology is not perfect, you might get glimpses of that. And the same way that it'd be sort of like a single neuron who normally just chugs along and does its thing, suddenly getting a picture of what the whole brain is doing, and then go right back to its everyday what's going on. Kind of like that. That's one way of looking at it. I don't know if that helps, but
Madhusri, you had your hand up and then you put it down.
Yes, I think it got answered. My question was essentially that since we're talking about it in terms of universal consciousness, cosmic consciousness, isn't there a presupposition that there exists an ideal form, but only one form of consciousness that we are trying to get to, that the body is discovering? However, there does exist different forms of consciousness, different layers to consciousness. And also then, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, you've just come from India. Then again, we get into the discussion of, okay, then what is normal and then what is not normal, right? If you're talking about it in terms of, okay, this is when different elements integrate in a manner to create a state similar to cosmic consciousness, then we are presupposing that that is what we want to achieve, that is what is normal. So I was just going into that line, but I think that was spoken about.
well, right. And I don't know if I think you're right that putting value judgments on that might not help us much, because one way or the other, it seems possible that a biological system could occasionally stumble into it. And then, of course, the big question is, does that help the organism survive or not? And if you stumble into cosmic consciousness and you're at one with the universe and you don't really need to,
exactly.
you know, you're not going to reproduce anymore. So I think there's probably biological systems that keep that from happening too often. That entheogens and things like DMT and all that actually artificially lift the veil, as it were. And that's why people describe what they see under the influence of these drugs, if it doesn't cause them to be psychotic, which is actually a fractionating of consciousness. But again, another conversation. But yeah, great questions, great questions. As far as like the one, that is so far above my pay grade, I have no idea. All I'm saying is that I'm arguing for the existence of it. I'm not saying I know anything about what its existence is like. That's a dreaming God, I guess. I don't know.
John, maybe you can answer that.
Well, that would be
line.
part of my challenges here. So Eric, maybe you can respond to some of the standard refutations. So, for instance, to presuppose a cosmopsychism sounds like that's what you're doing. It's just you're just positing something where you haven't really properly prepared an argument for why we would assume that the universe itself is conscious, let alone how can it ponder itself? How can the cosmos ponder itself that passes on its self-consciousness to all things?
Right.
That would be one. You've also got the Genesis problem, and that is, how does the universe come into being to begin with? Then and then you would have the issue of having to deal with an infinite regress. You're always appealing to some other prior event or a series of things that would bring about this whole. So those are at least three fundamental issues that come to mind.
Right. Those would be kind of classic questions. And I had all of these when I was doing the review process with my paper. And they're great questions. And my answer to that is, it's kind of technical, which I get into in the heaps and syllables paper. As far as like the infinite regress goes, I basically just state that, like kind of with Aristotle, that you got to start somewhere with some kind of brute fact, or else you have infinite regress. And if you prefer that, go for it. But and so then it becomes a question of which brute facts are we going to help ourselves to? And my argument, really, long story short, is that the cosmopsychist metaphysics does avail itself of one big brute fact, but it's the only one. And it's that the universe is conscious, and everything else follows from that. Whereas the other systems, say physicalism or PanPsychism or whatnot, have their own sets of brute facts, but they have more, and they have brute emergence that they have to deal with as well. Whereas I don't have to deal with that. So it's a trade-off, right? It's a trade-off. And some of those questions may not be answerable, which I have to concede. As far as the Genesis problem goes, fantastic question. I'm not sure how that works. Cosmology is still trying to sort out exactly how the universe came into being, so I can only guess at what the answer might be to that. Although with the Big Bang Theory, some cosmologists say, as far as I understand it, that the entire universe must be considered to be a ginormous quantum entangled system, which is a very strong argument for holism, if you know anything about quantum mechanics. And if you don't, go ask Harold Adamsbacher and he'll explain it to you better than I could, right? Because he's more versed in that. So that's those two. Well, I think that answers those three. As you know, of course, any metaphysical system you orient yourself to, you're going to have kind of your bog standard problems and solutions that go with it. It's a trade-off, there's no perfect solution, sadly.
Well, yeah, thanks for at least offering up something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Claire, you had something to add?
Oh yeah, just a very simple question. This touches on what Roderick was asking, and also the question about the robin, actually. Could you just define for us how you view when something is a part and when something is a whole? It sounds, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds as though you're suggesting that consciousness arises when, I think you said, when there is a point where a system is integrated enough to produce it.
Yes.
And you mentioned the issue of plants and consciousness. I'm thinking about the work of Monica Galliano, and I'm wondering if you're also then equating consciousness purely with psyche. And so when is consciousness in psyche? When is psyche in consciousness?
Right.
And if you're talking about the universe as a whole, do you mean the universe that we know about, or are you also then including the fact that that universe could theoretically be a part of something much larger that we may or may not yet know about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I only feel qualified to comment on the universe that we know. I don't feel like I could talk about consciousness as we don't know it. And so I try to work within that framework. And then could there be something beyond that? Absolutely. And I don't have any real good way of knowing what is outside of the limits of my understanding. Because as soon as I say X is outside of my understanding, of course, the question arises, well, how do you know that? If it's outside your understanding, you know? But getting back to more what you're asking, the distinction between consciousness and psyche is a good one. I'm kind of using them interchangeably, but with relatively more integrated systems, you do see a change in the quality of consciousness, or maybe you could say psyche, meaning that relatively less integrated systems are going to be more associated with what we might call unconscious, but it's still psyche. So
is the robin less integrated than us then, in that view? Isn't that rather speciesist?
Well, they
I think Mary Midgley would argue with you on that.
Maybe, yeah, she might. I don't know if I want to go into that boxing ring. I think they have the consciousness that they need to do what they need to do. Yeah. And of course, you could also say too that they are themselves part of a larger system, just like we are. And what about the consciousness of that system?
So where is a part a whole, and where is a part simply a part? So is an atom a part, or is an atom a whole?
So a part, I'm defining that as something that is relatively isolated.
Okay.
So it's just simple observation that when if we were to take the 10 billion or so neurons in the brain, say, or whatever the number is, and take them all apart from each other and stick them into petri dishes, then each individual neuron might have its own kind of mini neuron consciousness, possibly, but you wouldn't have what we see as a human consciousness unless you put them all back together. And so what do I mean then? Well, once you get that integratedness where every piece is interacting with every other piece, then it becomes irreducible. And Tononi has come up with a precise mathematical definition for reducibility. And it's quite technical, but it's basically saying that if I partition it any particular way, it doesn't function the way that it did before. Okay. So every piece of it is required for you to get the behavior that you see. So that would be a whole, and a whole in the sense I'm using it, because it has properties that cannot be replicated or derived from the individual parts of that system.
Okay.
Make sense? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Roderick?
Yeah, it's not a question so much, it's just I wanted to say, how much I appreciate what you're doing with this work, actually, because I mean, one way in which one can sort of judge metaphysical positions is the way that sort of C.S. Peirce suggests, the sort of abduction, how well it how well things make sense in the light of the model that you're presenting, right. How it makes things make natural sense of things, and the model that you've presented, whether as does Harold Atmanspacher's version of it, both make a tremendous sense of Jung's later thought. Yeah, I think they as you pointed out, concepts like synchronicity, the psychoid archetype, the unus mundus, which are unintelligible, if not insane from a physicalist perspective,
absolutely
become natural and make total sense.
Yeah, and you don't have to invoke any sort of faith-based supernaturalism or any of that kind of thing. It's just like, well, it's just how the universe is. Yeah, so it's not a proof of their value, but it's an argument in their favor as a form of metaphysics. So it's not just, I mean, this is also kind of contra Jung, because Jung, of course, as you pointed out, he was very cagey about engaging in metaphysics, but he needn't have been so cagey, I don't think, because there are ways in which
you know, metaphysical claims can be empirically constrained because they make good sense of what we do experience. And there's a whole range of phenomena that Jung was interested in, his kind of interest in paranormal phenomena and mystical phenomena and so on, which just don't make sense within a physicalist framework. But within a framework such as you presented, or as Harold Atmanspacher has presented, they become very intelligible and very investigable. You know, it's a very different and fruitful way of looking. So you know, I think this is, you know, this is where where more thought should be directed, I think. So thank you.
I connect this too with this idea of individuation as well, and the quest for greater integratedness.
Absolutely.
Right, because that's higher levels of consciousness, as he would maybe argue.
Yeah.
And so also in combination with that, I would think, I didn't really get into this, but rather than claim that the brain's job and purpose is to create models of the outside world, I don't agree with that. I think it's the psyche is a meaning-making organ. It's that trying to pull everything together into a coherent whole all the time. And within this metaphysics, that makes perfect sense, because it would strive towards that to a degree, of course. So that kind of just approach, that holistic approach, I think, is just all over Jung, and he never really quite articulated it clearly. You know, but he impinged on it all the time. It's very non-reductive, right? All the time complaining about reductive theories. Yeah.
Carol, you've got time for a quick word.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Thank you, Eric. That was all pretty mind-boggling stuff. And I want to go back to where you started, and thank you, it's great stuff. I want to go back to where you started, where you said it's all too easy to give somebody a drug in your job, but you are a Jungian analyst. And I wonder what impact all of this has on your daily clinical work.
Well, I don't actually have a card carrying, you know, Jungian analyst, you know, thing. I don't have that diploma, but I do view even the patients I see here at the State Hospital, the sickest of the sick. And how this plays out for me is the whole idea of integratedness helps me to understand their psychosis, which otherwise seems very random and inexplicable. But when you work with these very psychotic patients long enough, you start to see that there is meaning. There's a purposefulness behind it. But the problem is, because their psyche is fractionated because of either drugs or neurodevelopmental problems with, like, schizophrenia, for example, they lack that level of integratedness, but it's just enough to where you get things like delusions and hallucinations rather than full loss of consciousness. Many times they'll tell me about their, you know, various delusions and things that are really, most likely they emerged as metaphors within their psyche, but because their consciousness is so fractionated, they take it literally and it becomes projected.
Sure.
Right. And so, like, I had a patient who was telling me that her entire family was eaten by cannibals, these cannibals riding around in organ trucks, you know, and once she started to respond to the medication, I asked her again about that. She said, well, we didn't get along, and I found that she was in the foster system for many years. And she said, and she just at one point she just said, they're dead to me. But that was a metaphor in that case. But if you trace that back to before she was a little bit more coherent, that would have been translated into a delusion. They died, you know. And so that's kind of how all this works with my clinical work, with this very psychotic patients. And then with psychotherapy patients, it's the same thing, but it's more, quite a bit more subtle.
And do you think there's something about a disintegrated system that you're talking about that is actually working because it's attracted to your more integrated system?
So you're asking, is there a fascination with?
Sorry, but is a mind that is disintegrating attracted naturally to a more integrated mind?
I don't know. I've never wondered that. That's a great question. Maybe that would be kind of especially in a very socially oriented species such as Homo sapiens.
Well, it happens with mothers and babies, doesn't it? Presumably.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how that fits in with your theory, but you know.
Well, and all sorts of social attachments evolutionarily evolve from that bond. And humans have just immense amounts of social attachment energy. So very likely, I think.
Thanks. I think our time's up.
Okay.
I think arrived at Carl Rogers in the end. Erik, thank you very much. That's been fantastic, your presentation, and everybody's really responded to your energy and positivism. So, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
So much, Erik.